We've all been there. You buy perfectly straight lumber from the store, bring it home, and find it curled up like a potato chip less than a week later. Well, today I'm going to share my tips on how I keep lumber from warping. So why does it move? Well, I'm not here to explain the theory behind wood movement based on things like how the wood was sawn or grain direction or things like that. There are plenty of videos out there that explain it way better than I ever would, and I'll link some of those down below. But in plain language, wood will move if it's allowed to dry unevenly. So if there's uneven moisture exchange with the surrounding air, it's likely to warp. For example, you have a freshly milled board or panel, you leave it down flat on your workbench or your table saw, you're very likely to find it warped the next morning. We've all been told that lumber needs to acclimate to your workshop. You should never go out and buy some lumber from the store, bring it home, and immediately start to work on your project. Instead, you should let the lumber sit for a minimum of a few days to let the moisture levels even out and reach its equilibrium. But inevitably when we do this, and I know from experience, the lumber warps. There are a few things that we can do to help minimize this. The first being to select the best boards that you can find that are straight and free of defects. Number 2, strive for even moisture exchange between the lumber and the air. And this applies to both when you store the lumber and the way you mill it too. And number 3 is to restrain wood movement, like applying weights when drying the lumber and assembling boards immediately after milling if possible. And we'll get into all of this in more detail, but first let's talk about my workspace. I work out of an old single-car garage with concrete walls. There's no insulation and there's no climate control. Well, not exactly. I do have a small heater up there on the ceiling that I keep at a bare minimum temperature in the winter just so things don't freeze. And then when I want to work in here, I crank up 2 space heaters just to keep things warm enough so I can actually stand to be in here. In the summer, I do have a dehumidifier back there that I run pretty much 24/7. It does help to control humidity levels in here, but it's far from perfect. So all to say that I see a crazy fluctuation of heat and humidity in my workshop. In the winter, it might be 10 degrees in here and 30% humidity, whereas in the summer, it'll be 25 with 60% humidity, and that's despite my little dehumidifier back there. As you can imagine, this crazy fluctuation in humidity would likely have a negative impact on lumber and make it warp significantly, but I do have a bunch of tricks that I want to share with you on how to prevent that from happening. When you go and buy rough lumber for your next project, the best thing that you can do is stack and sticker them. This just means piling them up with spaces in between each board so that each of the boards can breathe evenly on all sides. To do this, you simply need to cut up even strips of wood. I just use pine that's been well dried. These ones are 1 1/4 inch wide by 3/4 inches thick, but it could be 3/4 by 3/4 or 1 by 1 or whatever. One key factor is to keep them off the ground. I don't want the boards in contact with the concrete floor soaking up moisture, so I'll start with 1 row of stickers before laying the first board. I place the stickers about 18 inches apart to support the boards evenly and keep the stickers lined up from 1 row to the next. Ideally, you want to make sure that your stack is on level ground too. Once you reach the top, it's important to add weights on the top to hold everything down. Otherwise, the top boards will curl and warp on you. I like to use a sacrificial piece of construction grade lumber like a 2x6 or a 2x8 to use as dead weight. If you have cinder blocks, you can put those on top, that's ideal, but you can use anything heavy that you have on hand like paint cans or bricks in my case. This is the ideal scenario and also, by the way, how you would dry wet or green wood, meaning wood that's been freshly cut and still has a very high humidity content. Now honestly, I rarely ever do this. Usually the hardwood I buy is dry and stable. My lumberyard does store it outside, though it's under cover so it's protected from the rain and snow, but it is exposed to changing levels of humidity. So I do try to stack them and sticker them for at least a week when I bring them home, but after that I just pile them up on my lumber rack and I don't worry about them. They might be there for weeks or months before I ever use them. And I don't really worry about them warping after that because it's pre-milling, so whenever I'm ready to use them, I'll just plane them and joint them nice and square when I'm ready to use them for a project. Now, if you like to buy S4S lumber, meaning that it's already been plane jointed and squared up and all pretty on all 4 sides, then I definitely recommend that you stick your lumber to keep it as flat as possible. But easier said than done. And that's one of the main reasons I like to work with rough lumber. That, and it's much cheaper too. Construction grade lumber is a totally different story. Construction lumber like pine 2x4s and 2x6s are usually super wet when you buy them, meaning that they've been relatively freshly cut and still contain a really high moisture content because they haven't had time to dry yet. So when you bring it home, it'll start to dry almost immediately, which is what leads to warping and why construction grade lumber typically warps way more than hardwoods that have been kiln dried before you buy them. There are still a few things that you can do to keep your construction grade lumber from warping and twisting. First, you want to pick straight boards, and pick straight boards with as few defects as possible at the store. You want to avoid big checks and knots or pieces missing and things like that. Avoid the pith if you can, but that's pretty close to impossible with 2x4s. But you still want to check them to make sure they're as straight as possible, not curved or twisted, and with the fewest knots or any weird visual defects. Don't buy those ones. Second, as soon as you get home and unload the boards in your shop, you should sticker them like we talked about before. But seriously, that just seems like so much work, and I honestly just don't have the time, the energy, or the motivation to do that. So here's something I do instead. I'm sure I'll get all sorts of comments for this, but you know what? It works for me. I lay them all flat on the bench and then flip them on their side and stack them all together. Then I just grab some clamps and clamp them together tightly. And finally, I just slip a few strips of wood underneath so it can breathe on the underside. Every day I try to rotate the boards to move the ones that are on the inside towards the outside. Obviously, I try not to buy 2x4s months in advance, but I've used this for a week or two and I've had great results. I know it's not a perfect system, but this can make such a huge difference. I used this system when I was building my workbench and my miter station, and this will make the difference between having straight boards when you're ready to finally build that project, or having them all twisted and curled up like potato chips. So what about after you've milled your lumber? You have beautiful, freshly milled wood, square edges, and it's perfectly flat. But then you leave it, come back the next day, and it's cupped, twisted, bowed, whatever. Nightmare. Ideally, you want to do your joinery and assemble your pieces as quickly as possible after you've milled so you don't give them a chance to cup on you. Once they're locked together, they won't move that much, so that's the ideal scenario. But that's not always possible for a lot of us. Sometimes we need to leave it to the next day or even the next weekend before we move on to assembly. In that case, some more experienced woodworkers than I am would suggest to wrap all your boards in either garbage bags or plastic wrap, anything that completely seals them up and cuts them off from the air to avoid that moisture exchange and keep them from drying out unevenly. Again, I choose to do something a little different, maybe non-conventional, but it works for me. Personally, I might just stack and sticker them, or even what I do most often is just lay the boards on their sides, elevate them so that they can breathe evenly on all sides, make sure to space them out, and just let them sit like that. And I've had really great success using this method. Lastly, once the project is done, always try to finish it on all sides, even the ones that you won't see, like the bottom of the table. Applying finish helps stop that moisture exchange with the environment. It won't stop it completely, but it will minimize it. And if you only have finish on one side, that other side is going to continue to see changes in humidity as the environment changes, and it may ultimately lead to cupping. You don't want one side releasing humidity and the other one locking it in. Now, plywood is a whole different ballgame. Once warped, it's really hard to get it flat again. Ideally, you want to buy flat panels at the store. This usually means to avoid the ones on the top of the pile because they may already be curling up at the corners. And ideally, also only buy plywood sheets when you need them for a project so you don't risk them warping on you if they're laying around in a corner of your shop. If possible, I try to store plywood sheets vertically as flat as possible up against the wall. Use restraints or the weight of other boards to keep it pressed flat against the wall. Another method I find works well is to clamp plywood sheets together to help keep them flat as they're referencing off each other. I try to put clamps on every corner and some in the middle too to keep them pressed up against each other, and then try to prop up the stack vertically. Remember to always keep lumber, whether that's plywood or other types of boards, up off the ground using scrap blocks of wood. And worst case, if it does start to warp, you can always cut it up and use the flatter pieces in your projects or smaller pieces where the warping won't be as significant. So those are my tips for keeping lumber from warping in the shop. Remember, it's all about moisture exchange between the boards and the surrounding air, making sure that that happens evenly and restraining the boards while they do it. I hope these tips have been useful, and if you have any additional tips, be sure to share them in the comments down below. Until next time, thanks for watching, see you soon.